We've looked at the man named Ezra and surveyed the book of Ezra in 2 sermons. Those sermons dealt with the first 2 returns of the Jews from their Babylonian captivity. This evening we look at the 3rd return from captivity. This return is described in the book of Nehemiah. Ezra worked with Nehemiah, who led the 3rd return in 444 BC to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. The temple had been rebuilt, but still the walls were in shambles. The gates had been burned. They were made of wood, so they'd been burned. You basically had now an incomplete, unprotected city because it had no walls. As Nehemiah opens, we read the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. And he tells us that he received the report that the Jewish remnant who had returned to Jerusalem were there, but they are there and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down. The gates have been burned with fire. When Nehemiah heard that, he said that he sat down and wept. For some days he mourned and fasted. He also prayed. We have the words of his prayers and his prayer to God. He confesses his sins, the sins of others. He speaks of the law of Moses, that it said, if you disobey, you'll be punished, but if you obey, there can be restoration. And so Nehemiah is entreating for his own people, for himself, asking for help, asking for guidance. He says, give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. Who is this man? It is the king. Because the next sentence, the last sentence of chapter 1 says, I was cupbearer to the king. Nehemiah is still in Babylon. He is under the king. He's cupbearer. That's a fairly important position because he's apparently the one who actually brings the wine to the king. And so in chapter 2, we see that he came before King Artaxerxes, brought the wine to him. He says, when I came before the king, he said, I've never been sad in his presence before. I suppose if there's one thing you need to do, if you're working for somebody important, you need to pretend that everything is going okay with you, whether it is or not. You need to put on a happy face. But Nehemiah, for the first time in his life as he comes before the king, has a very sad face. And the king notices this. Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I think it was a Bork episode where someone said to him, it's written all over your face, and he responded, oh no, I'm breaking out in words. Well, it wasn't quite like that, but it was very obvious that Nehemiah was sad. Well, Nehemiah is a bit concerned. He's afraid. He's here before the king, this powerful man, and the king notices that he is not doing well, that he is sad. But he says, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king probably surprised Nehemiah, but he responds, what is it you want? Nehemiah says, I said a prayer to God. Then he basically asks, can I go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls of the city? The king says, well, how long do you think this will take? He wants him to come back to Babylon and work for him. But they make arrangements. Nehemiah gets a letter from the king that will help him on his journey to Jerusalem. Again, this is a very long journey, but he sets out to go to Jerusalem to organize the rebuilding of the walls of the city. In verse 10 of chapter 2, we hear about this fellow named Sanballat, not only him, but Tobiah, and they are opposed to what Nehemiah wants to do. They were disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. We're going to see those names again. They are going to oppose Nehemiah and the Jews in their efforts to rebuild the walls. Well, Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem. He inspects the situation. He does so quietly at first. He's there about 3 days, but he quietly goes around just to see how bad it is, and it is bad. The walls had been destroyed. The gates had been burned as he had been told. And he then says to the people, Jerusalem lies in ruins. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. We are here in a city that's in ruins. This is disgraceful. The nations will look upon us and they see, yes, we do have a temple rebuilt, but we have a city that cannot function as it ought to. It has the lack of defenses. Verse 18 of chapter 2, I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me, and what the king had said to me. Nehemiah says, God is with us in this. And so the people respond, well, let's start rebuilding. And they began this good work. But Sanballat shows up again. Sanballat and Tobiah. Also Gershom the Arab. They hear what is going on, that the rebuilding is started. They ridiculed Nehemiah and those who were working on the walls. Says, what is this you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? They're trying to shape this, that this is a rebellion. Well, Nehemiah has the king's approval to do this. Nehemiah answered. He says, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim to historic right to it. Basically, the enemies would have liked to have been involved, to have benefited from what was going on. Nehemiah says, you have no part in this. In chapter 3, we're told about the rebuilders of the wall. A lot of detail there about the names of the different people who worked on the rebuilding. When we get to chapter 4, there's once again mention of the opposition to the rebuilding. It's the same characters again. They are trying to belittle the efforts of the Jews as they are rebuilding. We notice down about verse 3, Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, what they are building, if even a fox climbed upon it, he would break down their wall of stones. They're not doing a good job. This isn't going to be a defense against anybody. A fox can climb up on the wall and knock it down. But again, we see that Nehemiah is leading the people and looking to God for help in what they're doing. He prays, hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. Then he says in verse 6 of chapter 4, so we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. The opposition continues. And when Sanballat and the others hear that it's progressing, they plotted. They were going to fight against the people in Jerusalem, stir up trouble. And again, verse 9, Nehemiah says, but we prayed to God, our God, and posted guard day and night to meet this threat. Well, we get to verse 10, and the people of Judah say, we've been working on this quite hard, and the strength of the laborers is giving out. There is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. The enemies were continuing their attacks. Before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them, and will kill them and put an end to the work. There were Jews who lived nearby who came and told Nehemiah what was going on. Wherever you turn, they will attack us. And so Nehemiah comes up with the plan that as they are rebuilding, that some of them will work on the rebuilding and some of them will be armed and watching for the enemy. They're going to basically discourage any attacks from the enemy, and that plan works. It always helps if you know what the enemy is up to, and that is the case here. So the work continues upon the rebuilding of the walls. In chapter 5, or before we get to chapter 5, it said we worked day and night. We didn't take off our clothes at night when we rested. We kept our weapons by our side. Even when we went for water, we were armed. So they were in a great position of being ready to handle any attacks that came against them. And they continued the rebuilding of the walls of the city. In chapter 5, we have a description of Nehemiah helping the poor. There were some who were taking advantage of the situation, some who had wealth and who were getting more wealth by abusing their fellow citizens. This is called to Nehemiah's attention. He addresses it, and so the charging of interest to their fellow countrymen is stopped. This is inappropriate. Some of the people had actually been mortgaging all of their land, all they had, to survive. And so their lands are returned. The charging of interest will stop. We also read in chapter 5, verse 14, that Nehemiah was appointed to be governor in the land of Judah. And this continued for several years. Not a bad promotion from cupbearer to the king to being governor of Jerusalem. There is further opposition to the rebuilding. We are not surprised with that. We read of that in chapter 6. Again, basically the enemies are just trying to stir things up. These Jews they're rebelling against the king in their efforts to rebuild the walls and the things they are doing. Again, we also read that Nehemiah prayed. He prayed, "Now strengthen my hands." There are plots against Nehemiah's own life, but he is able to quell those. When we get down to chapter 6, verse 15, so the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. Now, I've seen some building projects in our day with modern equipment that went pretty fast, and I've seen some. Does I-35 come to mind? I've seen some building projects that seem to go on and on and on, even with our modern technology, our modern equipment. But in 52 days, the walls of Jerusalem had been rebuilt. When the enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Nehemiah over and over again praises God. He does talk about, I did this, I did that, but he always says God was in on this. God was doing this. After the wall had been rebuilt, chapter 7, the doors had been put in place. The Levites were appointed. There was a different organization that took place. We have a list of exiles who returned, also in chapter 7. It was very important that there be a reformation of how things needed to be. Not only did the temple need to be rebuilt, not only did the walls need to be rebuilt, but the nation itself, the people, needed to be rebuilt. They had not been a nation for a long time. They had been in a foreign land in captivity. We notice in chapter 7 that those who cannot verify their genealogy are not allowed to serve as priests. You have to show that you're from the proper tribe. The Jews assemble in Jerusalem, and the law is read to them. And in a future sermon, we will discuss that in some detail. Also, again, as we saw in the book of Ezra, the People separate themselves from foreigners. They confess their sins. Especially, there is the matter of separating themselves from foreign wives. The people are so convinced by the work of Nehemiah, Ezra with him, that they make a covenant in writing. There's also concern that there's just not a lot of people in Jerusalem. Apparently, a lot of the people are living around Jerusalem, but the city needs to be repopulated, and so there are efforts made to do that. John Willis says of the work of Nehemiah, "The work of the Lord is never done without hindrances similar to those described in connection with the work of Nehemiah as he guided the rebuilding of the wall of Jerusalem. A great deal can be learned from examining these obstacles, and also from observing the way that Nehemiah dealt with these problems." And that's true. The Old Testament book of Nehemiah, written a long time ago, written about a situation far, far from here, has great application to our own situations that we face. Nehemiah showed great leadership. And part of that leadership was his reliance upon God. We always need to rely upon God to guide us in what we need to do. And we need to do what we know God wants us to do.